have the deep honor tonight of sitting next to Professor John Powell, who is my duty to introduce. When I asked John what I could do, besides lifting up his book, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Conceptions of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society, he said you could tell him that I grew up 6th of 9 children in a sharecropper's family. You could tell him that I teach when I can, when I'm not on an airplane. In this era, between the assassination, the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X and the Selma anniversary, in this era of Black Lives Matter, there is no more important person in the Bay Area that you could have invited to address us tonight than this man. Yeah. I don't know how he does it, directing the Haas Center for an Inclusive Society, being a professor of law, teaching African American and ethnic studies, writing books. But I hope you'll attend to this man and his admonitions about how we can move forward. It matters, friends. It isn't enough to congratulate ourselves on nights like this. We need to be moved to real action that crosses the generations, stops othering, and includes more people in the cause of all. John Powell.
Good evening. As the other John sort of indicated, I spend way too much time on planes. Just flew in last night from meeting with, having several meetings in Seattle. And I spoke this morning at Wisdom 2.0, which is a tech conference, where there were very few people our age. Marry these two groups. But they're struggling and trying to figure out what they can do and how to make some of their lives more meaningful, but also how to connect with others. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Ferguson and around the country and your work, but let me first just say my hat's off to you. Because even as John agitates us to reach across generations, I want to acknowledge that probably many of you have been doing this for generations. That's not easy. It's easy to get tired. The body starts to slow down. We don't recover as quickly as we used to. And there are a lot of things to distract us from the world. And you have not let that happen in your life. So I want to acknowledge that and thank you for that. Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, that the new rhymes with the old. There's a relationship, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. And as we think about Ferguson and all the stuff that's happening, I'm struck by there is historical through line going back decades of what was happening in the 50s and 60s and what's happening now. And I would even dare say that part of the role that you play as you take John's admonition to heart is to help people with that through line. Because one of the things about being young, which most of us was at one point, so I think you're the first one to face these problems. And so there's very little, if anything, history has to teach us. And as I was preparing for the talk today, I called some friends of different generations and said, what should I share with folks? What's going on? And there's a lot going on, as you might be aware of. And one example of what's going on, what's not going on, is exemplified by the Oscars. How many of you saw the Oscars a few days ago? Okay, some of you did. I didn't. I was on a plane. But there was a speech by one of the participants who basically said, look, women have been fighting for the rights of others for a long time, fighting for racial justice, fighting for LGBT. It's time for us, women, to put ourselves first. And then she elaborated on that off camera, basically suggesting that the work in Ferguson around police killings and others was, while important, was really detracting from the important work around equal justice for women. And then there was a flurry of emails back and forth in this socially media world we live in, and people calling each other names, and black women saying, we're women too. And we say, women, who are you talking about? Us. You're not talking about black women or Latino women. And I was reminded of the fight that ensued during and after the Civil War between the feminists and the abolitionists. And that the way it was framed was one group's interests was different and more important than another's. And we've seen that play out over and over again. And yet we fail to learn from it. We fail to learn how we can structure our movements, our lives, so that we're competing with each other. So yes, gender issues are quite important. Race issues are quite important. Economic issues are quite important. Disability issues are quite important. People are quite important. How do we actually frame a movement that acknowledges that? How do we frame a movement so that no group is othered? All groups belong. And we haven't learned from that. We haven't learned from the past. And if we don't learn from the past, we'll find the future keeps rhyming with the past. Each generation will make that mistake one more time. And the very frame, the very term, Black Lives Matter, for those of you who follow Ferguson closely, will be aware that that in and of itself has created tensions. Saying, what about Latino lives? What about Asian lives? What about white lives? What about Palestinian lives? And of course, it's a tricky thing because we all know that all lives matter. But then we have a system that does not reflect that. We have a system that by its action, words, and deeds, in fact, say some lives matter more than others. And as we try to engage that system to say all lives matter, we have a tendency, appropriately in some contexts, to focus on those lives that have been left out, to focus on the invisible. But how to do that so that other groups that are invisible, and even those that are somewhat visible, don't feel left out? It seems to me that's the challenge. You know, we're here in the Bay Area. The Bay Area has a rich and celebrated history. Years ago, I attended school here in the Bay Area. Coming from Detroit, getting on a train, taking a train out to California to go to Stanford. And then later returning, after a short and disappointing trip back east to go to Yale, I came back out here and went to Berkeley. Where there were protests every semester. And I actually remember one semester when I was in graduate school at Berkeley, I had delayed doing my studies, but I knew I had extra time because I knew the protests would cause classes to be canceled. And so that no matter what they said in the syllabus, I had an extra 3 weeks off. And to my chagrin, protest didn't happen that semester. I was kind of scared. What's the world coming to when Berkeley doesn't protest? But we're also in the Bay Area where the issue of Black Lives Matters was exemplified in the Black Panther Party. Where the issue of police killings was central to the formation and the mission of the Black Panther Party. And I'm not advocating that we relive that, but I am advocating that we learn from it. And as radical as people may think they are now, they still may have something to learn from Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party. Both what they did right and what they did wrong. The mistakes they made. And as people celebrate Selma, it's important to realize that we would not have had a civil rights movement without Rosa Parks and the Reverend. And I think it's important to remember that he was a Reverend, Dr. Martin Luther King, that the civil rights movement was not only an intergenerational, interracial movement, it was also a profoundly religious and spiritual movement. As important as King was, it's not clear he would have been as effective as he was, not only without Huey playing a role, but Malcolm. Where's our Malcolm today? Where's our King today? We tend to have a kind of political purity. We don't realize that different people, different groups have a role in terms of strategically moving us to a different society. Yes, protest is important. And Malcolm said, so early in my life, I have learned that if you want something, you had better make some noise. That's just the first step, though, making noise. So I want to suggest where we are and where we need to go. And again, my hat's off also to the people in Ferguson who are saying enough. Enough killing of Black lives. Enough saying Black lives don't matter. But how do we get there? Again, it's a long history. Michelle Alexander reminds us in The New Jim Crow that mass incarceration is a social strategy to deal with a dispossessed people. It's not a criminal issue. It's an issue of people not belonging to the country and needing to be policed. I was around, as many of you were, when Nixon was running for president. Nixon was losing. He was behind. And he went out into the suburb, and he made a speech. And in that speech, he said, we need to restore law and order in America. He was not talking about drug dealing. He was not talking about killing. He was not talking about burglars. He was talking about the civil rights movement. He was saying civil rights movement, blacks asking, no, demanding to be treated as equal citizens, that they were out of order, and the country needed to restore law and order. And when he made that speech, his associates and aides noticed a spike in his popularity, that it resonated with the white conservative population. And after that, it became a central part of his speech. Law and order, law and order, law and order. And I think back to like 1968, and there was one program on television that focused on law and order, if that, and that was Dragnet. You can't turn on television today without every station and every time slot having some program on law and order. So Nixon is saying, we need to put black people back in their place. The police has to reestablish law and order so those people understand their proper place. Well, the great communicator, Ronald Reagan, was not nearly going to be outdone by Richard Nixon. And so while Richard Nixon gave us law and order, Reagan gave us the war. And when only 3% of Americans thought there was a serious drug problem, Nixon declared a war on drugs. And I wrote at the time that really what he's saying is a war on black people. So it went from just policing black people to literally declaring a war on them. And as you know, that the prison population exploded, increasing by almost tenfold in this war. And so when we look at tanks and other military paraphernalia showing up in Ferguson, it's a straight line back to Nixon, back to Reagan, back to the idea that black people are out of order. But there's something even more pernicious going on than just the slogan that black people are out of order. You've already heard from some of your honorees that there's a relationship between what's happening in Ferguson and this extreme wealth inequality that has exploded in the country. And that's what I want to bring your attention to for a moment. There's very good data suggesting that the economic inequality, which political scientists and economists call economic polarization, that it was preceded by something else called political polarization. So when did this political polarization start? The political polarization started in the early 70s. And it was a reaction to the civil rights movement. And the political polarization, which was built upon the early iteration of something called the Southern Strategy, where we saw the tremendous realignment of the South, going from being solidly Democratic to being solidly Republican. And I know you guys and women are not political. At least for the purpose of tax purposes. But what was happening is that you saw a realignment of the country, which was using the anxiety, the fear of racial equality as a way of creating political polarization. You saw a re-articulation of the role of government. You saw an attack on the New Deal. And all of this was generated, motivated, by the concern that the racial and then later the immigrant other were making claims on public resources that were only appropriately available to whites. You might remember that, again, the great communicator talked about, yes, there are poor people in America, but there are those who are deserving and those who are undeserving. And they were taking good people's money and giving it to the undeserving poor, which reads black people, Latinos. And it wasn't just the Republicans, although Republicans were much more robust in this effort than Democrats. But you remember that Clinton gave us an end to welfare as we know it.
Yeah.
And put 1 million police on the street. What I'm suggesting is this, that our economic inequality that is so extreme in the United States now, which is accelerating from the 1970s to the day, if that's the vehicle where we drive policies, taxing policies and others, including Prop 13, so that the elite get to keep more and more of the growth of the economy. If that's the vehicle, the fuel for that vehicle is the anxiety about the other. And we usually don't connect those two things. That it's the anxiety about the other not only demonizes the other, but demonizes the role of government in terms of redistributing or using resources to benefit the other. Now this phenomenon is not just a US phenomenon. It's happening in Europe as well. And in fact, Robert Putnam prefigured this in Europe, and he went there and did some research, and he basically said, the growing diversity in Europe is creating tremendous anxiety that threatens to undermine the European welfare state. He wasn't talking about race. He was talking about the religious other. You can put any group into the other. The point is that you're attacking the state because the state, in its liberal expression, is reaching out to those who are considered the other. This is a strategy. These are not principal Islamophobic folks or principal racists. They're saying, how do we actually activate a populist movement against the state? That's what's new since the 1970s. We've had neoliberalism for a long time, neoliberalism for decades, but it never had a populist movement. What we have now is they have foot soldiers. Some of them are known as part of the Tea Party, where they are aggressively attacking the state, not corporations, aggressively attacking the state because they're saying the state is illegitimate. And the state is illegitimate because it's extending a hand not to the producers, but to the takers, as Mitch Romney said. A colleague of mine has written a book about this called Dog Whistle Politics. That we're blowing a dog whistle. We're creating racial anxiety through a dog whistle. And as you know, most of us can't hear a dog whistle. So it activates people, creates anxiety without being explicit. If you say this has anything to do with race, they'll say this has nothing to do with race. Yet, Obama is the most vilified president in US history. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with race. If you ask Americans, especially in the South, how do they feel about the Affordable Care Act, you get an almost even split. Some think it's good, some worry about it. If you ask them what they think about Obamacare, there's no split at all, they hate it. Why do we even call it Obamacare? We don't call Social Security Roosevelt Security. We're vilifying it. We're using anxiety about the other, not just to attack the other, but to attack the government and the role of government itself, to repurpose government. So when we look at Ferguson, an issue of Black Lives Matter, that has in some fashion been an issue in this country since the country was founded. Certainly in slavery, certainly in Jim Crow, certainly in segregation. We can sort of trace years of policing, lynching, killing of blacks, as blacks try to assert that yes, their lives matter as much as white lives matter. We can think about New Orleans, where we saw thousands of blacks trapped on roofs. And what was the United States response? Send in the military. Not to help those stranded blacks, but to keep them in their place, to keep the white community safe. Going in with loaded guns and bayonets pointed at American citizens in the midst of catastrophe. And that didn't change until General Armory went in and said, put your guns down. These are American citizens. Can you imagine a national disaster that our response is to send in the military to keep people in their place? I went to Miami, I worked in Miami because there was McDuffie riots. McDuffie, a black man in Miami, had been killed. There was the Fruitville shooting the police here. And every day, if you watch the paper, there's someone being killed, disproportionately black and Latino, by the police. And so we owe the debt of gratitude to the people in Ferguson that's actually connecting the dots. They're saying, this is going on and it needs to stop. And again, my hat's off to those folks, and I actually have contact with them. But I say to them, if you think you're Malcolm, where's your Martin? If you think you're Martin, where's your Malcolm? What is your larger strategy? And how do you do this in a way that even as you focus on black lives, you don't create a binary, that you create a template which connects all Americans, and even those who we don't call Americans. How do you connect this to the thing that's happening in Washington, Latino being killed? How do you connect this to Trayvon Martin? How do you connect it to what's happening here in San Francisco? So what's next? What's their role and what's our role? I think protest is critical to change, but it's not enough. And as we celebrate the protests of the Bay Area, as we think about the Occupy movement, I want to suggest to you that the Occupy movement did not have a strategy to build a sustainable program. It did not have strategy to change the infrastructure. And while I think it's critical to get the right people elected, it's also critical to think about institution design. How is our democracy structured? And right now, the right wing is structuring our democracy so that more and more people with money have more and more power. So I think this points us in the direction that we should move. And I want to end just with a few comments. One, there's a reason we call our conference Belonging and Othering, because we think conceptually that's the through line. We all want to belong. We all want to make claims on our society, and none of us want to be marginalized. None of us want to be other, whether it's because of our sexual orientation, our age, our disability, our religion. How do we build what I call the circle of human concern with no one on the outside? And in my work, what I suggest is that when corporations occupy the center of that circle, all people are othered. All people are othered. And I call for something that I titled Targeted Universalism. That we all have universal goals, but our strategies, our pathways to get to those universal goals will necessarily be different because we're situated differently within society. So an example would be a person in a wheelchair. We have an escalator to get us to the third floor. That structure does not serve the person in the wheelchair. We could try to fix the person in the wheelchair, or we could say the structure itself is flawed. And I'll just end by saying we have a deeply flawed structure right now. We're not situated the same within that structure, but that structure is not a structure that says we all belong. And that structure right now is tilted to those who are rich and wealthy.
Right.
And until we change that, then we will continue to have a society that's deeply fractured, where not only black lives don't matter, but most lives don't matter. Thank you.